Every major tech company racing to build a quantum computer has been betting on the same secret hope, that their specific approach, their specific qubit, their specific physics, would eventually become the one that wins everything. The one ring, so to speak, the single technology that makes every rival obsolete. Somewhere inside a windowless office in Arlington, Virginia, a DARPA program manager looked at that entire race and made a bet against all of them at once. Not on which qubit wins, on the idea that any of them ever will. Read that again. The Pentagon just put real money behind the theory that the quantum computing industry's biggest assumption is wrong, and it's asking bitter corporate rivals to start building machines together instead. To understand why this bet is so genuinely unusual, you first need to understand exactly how strange and fragmented the current quantum computing landscape actually is, because it's nothing like the tidy, unified story most coverage of this technology tends to tell. When people talk about quantum computers, they often talk as if there's one single kind of machine, steadily getting better every year, the same way a smartphone gets a little faster with each new model. That's not what's actually happening. Right now, there are at least 4 genuinely different, fundamentally incompatible ways to build a working qubit, the basic unit of quantum information every quantum computer depends on. Some companies build their qubits from superconducting circuits, tiny loops of metal cooled to temperatures colder than deep space. Others trap individual charged atoms using precisely tuned lasers, a completely different physical approach called trapped ions. Still others use neutral atoms, suspended in place by beams of light, or photonic systems that encode information directly into particles of light itself. Each of these approaches comes from an entirely separate branch of physics, built by entirely separate teams of engineers, chasing entirely separate technical roadmaps. And for years, the unspoken assumption across almost the entire industry has been that eventually, one of these approaches would simply win, proving itself so far superior to the others that every competing company would either adopt it or fold. This is precisely the assumption Justin Cohen, the DARPA program manager overseeing this new effort, has decided not to believe. In an interview with the defense publication Breaking Defense, Cohen laid out his reasoning with a bluntness rarely heard from a government official managing a public research program. Looking at all the competing approaches to building a quantum computer, he explained, it's possible that one day the dust will settle and one competitor will have produced the one ring to rule them all, the perfect all-purpose quantum bit or qubit for all the technology's potential applications. And then came the sentence that reveals exactly why DARPA decided to launch an entirely new, multi-million-dollar program built around the opposite premise. I'd say that it's pretty clear that on any kind of timeline that we have clear insight on, there will be no perfect qubit species or modality. Think about the weight of that specific statement. This isn't a scientist expressing personal skepticism in an academic paper nobody outside the field will ever read. This is a federal program manager deciding how to allocate genuine taxpayer money, publicly stating that he does not believe the underlying premise most of the entire quantum computing industry has been quietly operating under for years. He's betting against the very idea of a single winner, and he's putting real government funding directly behind that bet. The program born out of this specific philosophical stance is called HARK, short for Heterogeneous Architectures for Quantum, and DARPA formally launched it on April 14th of 2026, framing it as a 24-month initiative designed to overcome what the agency itself describes as one of the most persistent, most stubborn barriers standing in the way of practical quantum computing. To understand exactly what problem HARK is trying to solve, you need to understand a specific, almost uncomfortable irony sitting at the heart of nearly every quantum computer currently in existence. Despite all the genuine rapid progress happening across the broader quantum computing field, according to DARPA's own official materials, most current approaches are built around a single type of quantum bit, which is the basic unit of quantum information. Or this constraint, DARPA explains, forces researchers to design entire systems around the limitations of one technology, rather than building something genuinely optimized from the ground up. Every function a quantum computer needs to perform, processing calculations, storing information reliably, and communicating that information between different parts of the machine, currently gets forced through the exact same narrow technological bottleneck, whatever specific qubit type that particular company happened to bet its entire research program on years earlier. Here's where DARPA's proposed solution reveals a genuinely clever, almost obvious insight once you actually hear it laid out clearly, an insight borrowed directly from a technology you're using this very moment to watch this video. Think about the device sitting in your pocket or on your desk right now. It doesn't run on a single universal chip trying to handle every possible computing task equally well. It runs on a genuinely heterogeneous collection of specialized hardware working together in careful coordination. A central processing unit, a CPU, handles general logic and everyday tasks. A graphics processing unit, a GPU, handles the specific kind of parallel, repetitive calculations needed to render images, and increasingly, to train artificial intelligence models. Specialized chips called ASICs handle other narrow, specific functions with extraordinary efficiency precisely because they were never designed to do anything else. DARPA's own materials draw this exact comparison directly. The resulting homogeneous model, the agency states, describing today's typical quantum computer, stands in stark contrast to classical computing, which derives its power from heterogeneity through the integration of specialized processors such as CPUs, GPUs, and ASICs, each optimized for specific tasks. Read that comparison again, because it reframes the entire quantum computing race in a genuinely useful way. Classical computing didn't become powerful by finding one perfect chip and using it for everything. It became powerful, specifically, because engineers learned to combine multiple, genuinely different specialized components, each one handling exactly the job it was naturally best suited for. HARK is asking the entire quantum computing community to learn that exact same lesson, decades after classical computing engineers already learned it themselves. To understand why this specific lesson matters so much for quantum computing specifically, you need to understand something genuinely important about why different qubit technologies actually differ from each other in the first place. Because these aren't simply cosmetic differences between competing brands offering roughly equivalent products. According to detailed reporting on this exact question, each kind of qubit carries genuinely distinct, often mutually exclusive strengths and weaknesses. Some kinds of qubits maintain their fragile quantum state for considerably longer stretches of time than others, a property physicists call coherence, essentially how long a qubit can hold onto reliable information before environmental noise corrupts it. Some qubit types require dramatically less elaborate, less expensive cooling infrastructure than others, a genuinely significant advantage, given how much of the cost and complexity in modern quantum computing traces directly back to the extreme cryogenic refrigeration many leading architectures currently demand. And some qubit types transmit information considerably more efficiently across a network or between separate components inside the same physical device, a capability that matters enormously once you start trying to build genuinely large-scale, distributed quantum systems rather than small, isolated laboratory demonstrations. Here's the genuinely uncomfortable part of this picture that most companies would rather not highlight publicly. No single qubit technology currently available anywhere in the world excels at all three of these properties simultaneously. Every company has been forced to accept significant trade-offs, choosing which specific strengths to prioritize and which specific weaknesses to simply live with, because their entire architecture gets built around one single qubit type from the very beginning. This is exactly the gap Justin Cohen identified as genuinely, deliberately missing from the private sector's current research priorities. And understanding why reveals something important about how competitive markets sometimes fail to solve certain kinds of problems on their own, even when everyone involved would theoretically benefit from a solution. What we're hyper-focused on, Cohen explained, describing DARPA's specific investment strategy, is the interstitial pieces that could link up those systems, specifically emphasizing that the agency is deliberately funding technologies currently missing from corporate roadmaps. Think carefully about why exactly this specific gap exists, because it's not simply an oversight nobody happened to notice yet. Every major quantum computing company currently competing in this space has a powerful, entirely rational financial incentive to perfect its own proprietary qubit technology, to prove that its specific approach is the superior one worth every future customer's investment. None of these companies has any natural built-in incentive to spend their own limited research budget building, and DARPA's institutional interest in exactly this kind of hybrid, multi-technology approach to quantum computing actually predates HARK by several years, offering useful, concrete historical evidence that this entire strategy reflects sustained, patient institutional thinking rather than some sudden reactive pivot. Back in 2020, the agency launched a considerably earlier program called ONISC, specifically designed to demonstrate a genuine, measurable quantitative advantage for quantum information processing over purely classical supercomputers, focused specifically on a particularly challenging category of mathematical problem called combinatorial optimization. That earlier program deliberately pursued what DARPA described at the time as a hybrid concept, combining intermediate-sized, genuinely noisy, error-prone quantum processors with classical computing systems specifically focused on solving optimization problems relevant to both defense applications and broader commercial industry. Crucially, the team selected for that considerably earlier program were already exploring multiple genuinely different physical qubit types simultaneously: superconducting qubits, trapped ion qubits, and specialized Rydberg atomic qubits, all pursued in parallel rather than the agency committing its funding exclusively to a single preferred architecture. Think about what this longer institutional history actually reveals about HARK's true origins. This isn't DARPA suddenly discovering in 2026 that different qubit types have different strengths and weaknesses. That understanding has clearly been shaping the agency's quantum computing investment strategy for at least 6 years. And HARK represents the natural, carefully considered evolution of that same underlying philosophy, now scaled up dramatically and formalized into a dedicated program specifically focused on solving the interconnection problem directly, rather than simply exploring multiple architectures separately the way ONISC had done years earlier. Think, too, about the genuinely practical implications that would follow if HARK's underlying bet actually pays off successfully over the coming years, because the potential applications extend directly into stakes explored across nearly every other piece of quantum computing coverage produced on this channel. A genuinely heterogeneous quantum computer, one combining, say, a stable long-coherence qubit type, specifically optimized for reliably storing quantum information over extended periods, alongside a separate, faster qubit type, specifically optimized for rapid processing, alongside yet another qubit type, specifically optimized for efficiently communicating information across a distributed network, could theoretically deliver genuinely superior real-world performance compared to any single homogeneous system built entirely around one compromise-laden qubit technology trying, and inevitably failing, to excel at every single one of those distinct functions simultaneously. This directly echoes the broader hybrid quantum classical convergence trend explored extensively across recent coverage of NVQ-Link, the Open Compute Project's data center integration standards, and the growing wave of partnerships connecting quantum hardware companies directly to classical supercomputing infrastructure. HARK essentially applies that exact same hybrid, best tool for the job philosophy one level deeper, not simply connecting quantum processors to classical GPUs, but connecting genuinely different kinds of quantum processors directly to each other, creating systems that are hybrid on multiple, simultaneously overlapping levels at once. So where does this leave the honest, carefully researched answer to the central question sitting inside this video's own title? Did DARPA genuinely just change how quantum computers will be built, and are rival qubit technologies actually being asked to work together? The evidence gathered here supports a genuinely affirmative answer, the one that demands the same careful, honest qualification this channel has consistently applied throughout its entire coverage of this rapidly evolving field. DARPA has, without question, launched a real, substantively funded, carefully structured program explicitly designed to challenge the quantum computing industry's dominant, largely unquestioned assumption that a single qubit technology will eventually emerge triumphant over all its rivals. 19 genuine teams, spanning 15 separate organizations, are actively collaborating right now across 2 carefully parallel tracks, specifically to build both the software and the physical hardware bridges needed to make heterogeneous, multi-technology quantum computing a genuine working reality rather than merely an appealing theoretical concept discussed at industry conferences. This represents a genuine, verifiable, and genuinely unusual shift in institutional strategy, one directly informed by DARPA's own considerably longer history of hybrid, multi-architecture quantum computing research, stretching back at least to 2020. What hasn't happened yet, and what an honest telling of this story has to acknowledge clearly, is any completed, independently verified demonstration proving this heterogeneous approach genuinely delivers on its ambitious promise at meaningful scale. This program remains, as of right now, firmly in its early foundational stages, 24 months of intensive collaborative research that has really only just begun. But perhaps the single most genuinely important thing about this entire story isn't any specific technical detail buried inside the HARK program itself. It's the underlying philosophical bet the program represents. A bet that runs directly against the grain of how almost every previous major technology race in modern history has typically unfolded. Most competitive technology races eventually do produce a single dominant winner, whether that's one specific video format, one specific mobile operating system, or one specific social media platform eventually capturing the overwhelming majority of an entire market. DARPA's Justin Cohen looked directly at quantum computing's own version of that exact same race and made a deliberate, publicly stated bet that this particular technology might genuinely be different, that the physics underlying different qubit types is different enough, and the practical trade-offs involved are severe enough, that no single approach will ever cleanly conquer every application quantum computing might eventually be useful for. If he turns out to be right, the entire future architecture of quantum computing might look considerably less like today's fierce, winner-take-all corporate rivalry, and considerably more like the deliberately diverse, specialized ecosystem already quietly powering the ordinary device you're using to watch this video right now, different specialized components, each handling exactly the job it does best, working together inside one unified, genuinely collaborative system. If you want to understand exactly what emerges once HARK's initial 24-month research phase concludes, and whether any of these 19 separate teams actually managed to demonstrate a genuinely working heterogeneous quantum system combining multiple rival qubit technologies successfully, that's precisely the story we'll be tracking closely as it continues to unfold. So make sure you're subscribed before that milestone finally arrives. Before you go, I want to know what you honestly think about everything you've just heard. Does DARPA's bet against a single quantum computing winner feel like genuine strategic wisdom, correctly recognizing something the competitive private market has structurally been unable to solve on its own? Or do you think the fierce, deeply proprietary competition currently driving this entire industry forward will ultimately prove too strong for rival companies to genuinely, meaningfully cooperate at the level this ambitious program actually requires? Leave your honest answer down in the comments below, and as always, I read every single one. Through 2024 and 2025, as the low extents persisted rather than bouncing back, the ocean heat hypothesis gained ground because researchers studying long-term Antarctic sea ice behavior noted something troubling. For decades, satellite data had shown the ocean surrounding Antarctica appearing to defy global warming almost entirely, holding its temperature while the rest of the planet heated up. That apparent resistance, some scientists began to suspect, wasn't the ocean actually staying cool. It was heat quietly accumulating in deeper layers, hidden beneath a stable cap of colder surface water, effectively banking warmth that hadn't yet been allowed to surface. If that theory held, the 2023 collapse wasn't a random anomaly. It was the moment the bank finally opened. And there was troubling supporting evidence even in 2026 itself. In the middle of the Antarctic winter this year, when a large stretch of West Antarctica, one of the coldest places on the entire planet, averaging around minus 34 degrees Celsius through the season, should have been frozen solid by every seasonal model, a significant area simply wasn't. Researchers pointed directly to that same hidden ocean heat, finally reaching the surface and interrupting the refreeze in the dead of winter, something no prior model had predicted could happen at all. But then came the 2026 summer rebound. Near-average ice spread wider than any of the previous 4 years, and it complicated the story rather than resolving it. If deep ocean heat had truly broken through and destabilized the system permanently, a sharp recovery like this shouldn't have been possible so soon. Researchers at the Cooperative Institute for Research in the Environmental Sciences pointed instead to a more immediate, more mundane cause for 2026 specifically, a shift in southern winds that, for this one season, happened to push surface ice outward from the continent